Scotland has a particularly big interest in the sea. If you look at our geography, we've got the second longest coastline in Europe, about 18,000 kilometres. That's actually longer than the coastline of Brazil. So we've got a huge number of islands, in excess of 800 islands. 118 of those islands are actually inhabited as well. And we have an EEZ of in the region of 470,000 square kilometres. And also a number of assets. We've got a big oil and gas sector operating in the North Sea, a fishing industry that is probably one of the largest in Europe, and about 60% of all of our fisheries landings in the UK go through Scottish ports. Aquaculture is the second largest food producer in Scotland, and by value. We also have obviously a number of designated areas for renewables development up in the Pentland Firth in particular, Orkney Waters. We know we have enormous marine renewable assets up there that we're trying to exploit through the development of tidal power and wave power. We also have a number of protected areas. We have, if you actually look at some of the ecosystem asset valuations for Scotland, it's somewhere in the region of £11 billion worth of if you like, capital assets, natural capital assets in our marine systems. And that is also sort of represented by about 40,000 different species, many of which are of international importance, particularly some of our marine mammals and our seabird populations. So there's a strong driver in Scotland to have a number of key protected areas, and they are now an important part of our marine landscape in Scotland, and the way that fits in, particularly with respect to marine planning, is becoming particularly important. We're wrestling now with the way that we integrate all of these activities and the way those activities are changing. So, for example, the first one I mentioned was the oil sector. That's moving from basically being an exploration and production sector through to one that is now in decline, and as a result of low oil prices, we're moving towards an industry which is being decommissioned, probably at a rate which is far shorter than we actually thought we would actually experience. So there are some enormous challenges in terms of the marine environment, and Scottish Government has a particular interest in engaging with the marine science community, principally through MASTS.
And of course that will be underpinned with sound science.
Absolutely. I think increasingly the relationship between academic marine science and the needs of government and policy, particularly in Scotland, are developing particularly well. We have a very good relationship with government, and because of access to senior administrators in government, and their willingness to participate in our discussions and their interest in marine science, means that we probably are very privileged in being able to introduce ideas, new thinking to the way that we develop our legislation and the way that we actually manage our marine environment. So I think we're probably in a very healthy place at the moment.
And of course making that science accessible to people who may have an interest but are not necessarily scientists themselves is essential, and that's where MASTS also comes in.
Well, yep. I mean, a very important part of what we do is the process of proactive engagement, and that's a two-way process. We want a position of trust where they see us as being able to provide them with useful information in a form that they can use. So whilst we still pursue science excellence, and whilst we still are founded on being independent and objective in our science, we also recognise that government relies upon us increasingly to provide information that will help them develop their policies, strategies, and also to help them underpin their regulation.
And the political landscape in which you have to work, in which marine science has to work, of course, is changing. Very
rapidly. Obviously, with the decision of the UK to basically come out of Europe, that opens up a whole series of quite fundamental questions about the way that our seas will be legislated, the way that we will manage our environment in marine and marine systems generally, and also our relationships with other countries.
Interesting times ahead, challenging times ahead. Do you feel that Scottish marine science and MASTS in particular are well placed to steer a course through that?
In principle, yes. Obviously, there's always the sticky issue of funding, and looking forward, obviously, we've had access to European funding, particularly Horizon 2020 funding within the academic community. If we remain part of the single market, there is every chance that we might retain access to those funds. If we're not part of the single market, then I think government will have to look very carefully and quite swiftly at what alternatives there are in order to be able to support marine science at an appropriate level. It's quite important that we recognise the need for continuity in funding and also some fairly strong direction in terms of the way that we allocate funds, and in particular alignment between what we need to deliver in terms of good science to underpin good environmental practice, good advice to government, making sure that our advice and assistance to industry in that respect means that we develop sustainably. And in order to be able to do that, we have to be clear that the funding sources and the mechanisms that are in place in order to be able to support our work are sufficiently aligned that we actually deliver what we need to within the appropriate timeframes. I'm not sure at the moment that's necessarily the case, but I think these are discussions that will need to take place, and MASTS in many respects is well placed as a fairly large organisation with a fairly important and powerful constituency amongst its members, is probably well placed to feed into that debate.